"Give it up, lady. You can't even hit that huge target." Laughter echoed across the shooting range. She lowered her rifle, silent as if accepting defeat. But when the officer stepped forward, he wasn't looking at the target in front of her. He whispered, "Check the back wall." And the entire squad went dead silent. Her name was Eleanor Croft, 28 years old with long brown hair tied back in a practical knot. Her frame looked delicate, but her eyes held the focus of a laser beam. Most people at the shooting range that day had no idea who she really was. To them, she was just another woman trying to prove herself in a man's world. They saw the neat civilian clothes, the quiet demeanor, the way she kept to herself while loading ammunition. Eleanor Croft, one of the reserve officers, had muttered earlier, reading from the sign-up sheet, "Sounds like an actress, not a soldier." She had simply smiled and continued checking her scope. The truth was more complicated. 5 years ago, Eleanor had been the top sniper in the elite Reaper unit. She held records that most marksmen could only dream of. Her longest confirmed kill was at 1,800 meters in crosswinds that would make seasoned shooters pack up and go home, but she had left the military under circumstances she preferred not to discuss. Now she worked as a freelance shooting instructor, training security personnel and law enforcement. She stayed out of the spotlight, took cash payments, and avoided anything that might put her name in official reports. Today's reserve training exercise was supposed to be simple: test some new equipment, help evaluate a few promising recruits, collect her fee, and disappear. She hadn't planned on the attitude. "Look at her over there," another voice had whispered. "Bet she's never even fired a real rifle before." Eleanor continued her weapon check, running her fingers along the barrel, testing the trigger pull. The rifle was standard military issue. Nothing special, but she could work with anything. The range officer called for positions. Around her, 23 other shooters took their places. Most were young men, fresh-faced and eager to impress. A few were older veterans there to maintain their certifications. All of them had been talking loudly about their previous scores, their favorite weapons, their theories about proper technique. Eleanor had said nothing. She positioned herself at lane 15, adjusted her mat, and settled into a comfortable prone position. The morning sun was climbing, creating heat shimmer at the longer distances. Wind was picking up from the southwest, maybe 8 miles per hour with occasional gusts. The primary target stood at 300 meters. Standard bullseye, nothing challenging for anyone with basic training. But as Eleanor scanned the range through her scope, she noticed something else. Beyond the main target line, partially hidden by concrete barriers, additional targets had been placed at various distances. Test setups probably, or maybe advanced challenges for later in the day. One target caught her attention, 500 meters out, positioned on the back wall of the range complex. It was smaller than the others, and the red center circle looked to be about 2 inches in diameter. Between her position and that distant target, the main 300-meter target created a narrow window, maybe 6 inches of clearance on either side. Interesting challenge. "Shooters ready?" the range officer called out. Eleanor chambered around and took aim. When her turn came, the wind shifted slightly. Fine dust drifted across her line of sight. The primary target stood 300 meters away. Large, impossible to miss for anyone with basic training. Eleanor raised her rifle, drew a deep breath, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet sailed wide of the target. Complete miss. The laughter started immediately. "See, I told you so. Can't even hit a barn door. Maybe try darts instead, sweetheart." The comments came from behind her, where other shooters waited their turns. She could hear the smirks in their voices, the satisfaction of being proven right about the quiet woman who had dared to sign up. Eleanor lowered her rifle without expression. No frustration, no embarrassment, no defensive explanations. She simply ejected the spent casing and prepared for her second shot. 2 more attempts, the range officer announced, though his tone suggested he was already writing her off. The second shot also missed the main target. This time, the laughter was louder, more confident. "Somebody get her a bigger target, maybe start with something the size of Texas." One particularly loud voice called out, "Hey, lady, you sure you loaded that thing right?" A few people actually applauded the mockery. Eleanor remained motionless in her shooting position. Her breathing was controlled, her grip steady. To the casual observer, she looked like someone struggling with basic marksmanship fundamentals. But someone was watching more carefully. Staff Sergeant Marcus Thorne stood 20 feet behind the firing line, clipboard in hand, sunglasses hiding his expression. He had been observing the entire exercise, making notes on each shooter's performance. Thorne knew Eleanor from another life. He had been a junior NCO in a support unit when she was running missions with the Reaper team. He had never worked directly with her, but everyone in the command structure knew her reputation. Ghost Shot, they called her, the sniper who could thread needles at impossible distances. He had also heard the rumors about why she left the service, how she had refused to take a shot because civilians were in the danger zone, how command had called it a mission failure, even though her restraint had prevented an international incident. Now Thorne watched her prepare for the third and final attempt. The wind had picked up again. Dust swirled across the range. Heat shimmer made the distant targets dance. Standard conditions for a missed shot if you were aiming at the obvious target. But Thorne followed her sight line through his binoculars. She was not aiming at the 300-meter target. Her barrel was pointed slightly higher, angled to compensate for a much longer shot. Her scope was adjusted for maximum elevation. Thorne scanned the back wall of the range complex. There, partially hidden behind concrete barriers and almost invisible in the morning light, sat a secondary target, 500 meters out, with a red center circle, no bigger than a silver dollar. It was a test setup for advanced marksmen placed there for later in the day's training program. Most of the reserve shooters didn't even know it existed. To hit it from Eleanor's position, a bullet would have to thread the gap between the main target and its support post, maybe 6 inches of clearance on either side in crosswinds, with standard military ammunition from a rifle she had never fired before today. Thorne keyed his radio microphone. Eleanor took her final shot. The bullet streaked past the main target, drawing another round of derisive laughter. 3 for 3. Total washout. Somebody give her a participation trophy. The mockery reached its peak. Several shooters were actually pointing and laughing, treating her performance as the entertainment portion of their day. Eleanor stood up, cleared her rifle, and stepped back from the firing line. She said nothing in her own defense. She made no excuses about wind conditions or unfamiliar equipment. She simply waited. Thorne stepped forward and raised his voice above the continued laughter. "Before we move on," he announced, "I want everyone to do something for me." The range fell quiet, sensing something in his tone. "Turn around and look at the back wall." Confused murmurs rippled through the group as 23 shooters and various range personnel turned to face the rear of the complex. Thorne pointed toward the distant concrete barriers. "You see that secondary target at 500 meters? The one set up for this afternoon's advanced course?" A few people nodded, squinting to make out the small bullseye in the distance. "Someone want to walk back there and check the score?" One of the younger shooters jogged toward the back wall, his boots crunching on the gravel. The range fell completely silent, except for the sound of his footsteps. When he reached the distant target, he stopped, turned around, raised both hands above his head, and shouted back across the 500 meters, "Dead center! Perfect bullseye!" The silence that followed was absolute. 23 people stood frozen, trying to process what they had just learned. The woman they had been mocking for missing an easy 300-meter target had actually threaded a nearly impossible shot through a 6-inch gap to hit a much smaller target at almost twice the distance in crosswinds, with a weapon she had never used before. While they had been laughing at her, Staff Sergeant Thorne walked slowly down the firing line, his boots clicking against the concrete. The silence stretched on as everyone processed what had just happened. He stopped directly behind Eleanor's shooting position and turned to face the stunned crowd. "Let me tell you who you just spent the last 10 minutes laughing at," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the range. Eleanor remained motionless, staring downrange, but Thorne could see the slight tension in her shoulders. "This is Eleanor Croft, former Staff Sergeant Croft of the 75th Ranger Regiment, attached to Special Operations Command." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. The name meant nothing to most of them, but the credentials were impressive. Thorne continued. "She was the lead sniper for Task Force Reaper, one of the most classified units in the military. Her official record shows 47 confirmed kills at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. The murmurs stopped. Complete attention now. Her longest confirmed kill was at 1,800 meters in Afghanistan during a sandstorm with crosswinds gusting to 30 miles per hour. The target was an enemy sniper who had been picking off our guys for 3 days. Thorne paused, letting that sink in. She made that shot with a rifle that had been damaged by shrapnel. The scope was cracked. She had to calculate the trajectory in her head and aim using iron sights. One of the younger shooters, the same one who had been loudest with his mockery, raised his hand tentatively. If she's that good, why did she leave the military? Thorne looked at Eleanor. She gave an almost imperceptible nod. 3 years ago, Staff Sergeant Croft was positioned on overwatch for a high-value target elimination in Syria. Enemy commander responsible for multiple attacks on coalition forces. Clean shot, 800 meters, perfect conditions. He gestured toward Eleanor, who finally turned around to face the group. But when she looked through her scope, she saw something intelligence hadn't mentioned. There were children in the compound, kids playing in the courtyard, maybe 20 feet from the target. The range was dead quiet now. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. Command ordered her to take the shot anyway. Acceptable collateral damage, they said. Mission parameters allowed for civilian casualties if the target was eliminated. Thorne's voice carried a note of respect that hadn't been there before. Staff Sergeant Croft refused the order. A sharp intake of breath from several listeners. She held her position for 6 hours, waiting for the children to clear the area. Command kept ordering her to shoot. She kept refusing. Eleanor spoke for the first time since the shooting had ended. Her voice was quiet but clear. Eventually, they sent in a ground team. Took longer, cost more resources, put more soldiers at risk. But no children died. Thorne finished. But no children died, she confirmed. The young shooter who had asked the question looked confused. So what happened? Did you get the target? The ground team got him, Eleanor said. Mission accomplished, no civilian casualties, everyone went home. Then why did you leave the service? Thorne answered this one. Because some people in command felt that refusing a direct order, even for humanitarian reasons, showed unreliability under pressure. They questioned my judgment, Eleanor added. Suggested maybe I was too emotional for the job. An older man near the back of the group, clearly a veteran himself, shook his head in disgust. That's exactly the kind of judgment we need more of. Several others nodded in agreement. The young shooter looked embarrassed now. Ma'am, I'm sorry about what we said earlier. We didn't know. You shouldn't have to know, Eleanor interrupted gently. Respect shouldn't depend on someone's resume. She gestured toward the distant target where her bullet had found its mark. Today, when I saw that secondary target, it reminded me of something. She paused, organizing her thoughts. In combat, the obvious target isn't always the real threat. Sometimes the enemy you can't see, the one hiding behind cover, the one positioned where you don't expect them, that's the one who will kill you. Thorne nodded. That's why she aimed for the back wall target instead of the easy shot in front of her. But how did you even know it was there? Another shooter asked. Eleanor smiled slightly. Situational awareness. Before any shot, you scan the entire environment. I saw the secondary target when I was setting up. I saw the gap I'd need to thread. I calculated the wind drift and the trajectory. Why not just hit the main target first, then show off with the hard shot second? Because, Eleanor said, on a real battlefield, you don't get to take multiple shots. You get one chance, and you better make sure you're shooting at the right target. She gestured toward the 300-meter bullseye. That target was safe, no threat to anyone. But in a combat scenario, the hidden sniper at 500 meters is the one who's going to kill your teammates while you're celebrating hitting the obvious target. The lesson was beginning to sink in. Thorne added, this is why we run these exercises, not to see who can hit the biggest target, but to see who has the tactical awareness to identify real threats and engage them effectively. He looked around the group. How many of you even noticed the secondary target when you were setting up? A few hands went up reluctantly, maybe 5 out of 23. And how many of you would have chosen to engage it instead of going for the easy points on the main target? All hands went down. That's the difference, Thorne said, between marksmanship and actual combat effectiveness. A female shooter near the front raised her hand. Ma'am, can you teach us how to do that? The situational awareness thing? Eleanor considered the request. It's not about the shooting, she said finally. Any of you can learn to hit a bullseye at 300 meters. The hard part is training your mind to see the whole battlefield, not just what's directly in front of you. She pointed toward the distant target where her bullet had struck true. That shot wasn't about showing off. It was about demonstrating that real threats don't always announce themselves with bright colors, inconvenient positioning. The group was hanging on her every word now. The enemy sniper isn't going to set up at the range where you expect him. He's going to be farther out, partially concealed, positioned where most people won't even think to look. She shouldered her rifle. And if you spend all your time focused on the easy targets, you'll never even see them coming. 3 days later, Eleanor received an unexpected phone call. Staff Sergeant Thorne was on the line, his voice formal but respectful. "Ma'am, I have a request from the training command. They'd like you to consider leading a specialized course for our reserve units." Eleanor set down her coffee and walked to the window of her small apartment. "What kind of course?" "Tactical awareness and advanced marksmanship, specifically teaching soldiers how to identify and engage non-obvious threats." She had been expecting this call, though she wasn't sure she wanted to take on a formal teaching role again. How many students? The same group from the other day wants to sign up. All 23 of them, plus about 15 others who heard what happened. Eleanor smiled despite herself, including the young man who was so vocal about my shooting skills, especially him. Private Oliver Markham asked specifically if you'd be willing to work with soldiers who still have a lot to learn about respect and tactical thinking. The course ran for 2 weeks. Every morning at 0600 hours, 38 reserve soldiers gathered at the range complex, ready to learn from the woman they had once mocked. Eleanor designed the training around real-world scenarios. No more simple bullseye targets at predictable distances. Instead, she created complex firing exercises with multiple objectives, hidden threats, and civilian considerations. "Before you shoot anything," she told them on the first day, "you need to answer 3 questions. What am I shooting at? What's behind my target? And what am I not seeing?" Private Oliver Markham, the young soldier who had been loudest in his criticism, turned out to be one of her most dedicated students. He stayed after hours to practice the observation drills, asked detailed questions about wind calculation, and volunteered for the most challenging scenarios. On the final day of training, Eleanor set up the ultimate test. Each student had to engage multiple targets at varying ranges while protecting simulated civilians and identifying camouflage threats. The course was designed to be nearly impossible without the tactical awareness she had been teaching. Oliver Markham was the last to shoot. His first target was at 400 meters, partially concealed behind cover. His second was at 600 meters, positioned to simulate an enemy sniper. Between them, cardboard cutouts represented civilians who had to remain unharmed. He took his time, scanning the full range, calculating angles and safe zones. His first shot eliminated the 400-meter threat cleanly. His second shot threaded between 2 civilian cutouts to neutralize the distant sniper target. When the range went quiet, Eleanor walked over to check his targets. Both hits were center mass, no civilian casualties. She returned to where Oliver Markham waited, clearly nervous about his performance. "How did I do, ma'am?" Instead of answering directly, Eleanor reached into her gear bag and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. It was the target from her 500-meter shot 3 weeks earlier, the one that had silenced the laughter and changed everything. The entire training unit had signed it, along with a simple message: "Thank you for opening our eyes." She handed it to Oliver Markham. "You all taught me something too," she said quietly. I'd forgotten what it felt like to watch someone discover they're capable of more than they knew. Oliver Markham looked down at the signed target, then back at Eleanor. "Ma'am, permission to ask a personal question?" "Go ahead." Do you ever regret refusing that order? The one that got you discharged?" Eleanor looked out across the range, where targets stood at various distances, some obvious, some hidden, all requiring different kinds of courage to engage. "Every day," she said honestly, "but not for the reasons you might think." She paused. "I regret that it took so long for someone to teach you what you learned here these past 2 weeks. They thought I missed my target that day. But here's what I learned during my years in combat. Missing the obvious target isn't always a mistake. Sometimes it's the only way to hit what really matters. On the battlefield, survival isn't about being the best shot at the closest target. It's about seeing the threat that everyone else is ignoring. The sniper positioned where no one expects him. The danger hiding in plain sight while everyone focuses on what's directly in front of them. And when I looked through my scope that day at the shooting range, I saw what everyone else missed. A secondary target that represented real tactical thinking. A shot that required not just marksmanship, but situational awareness. The 300-meter target in front of me was safe. It wasn't going to hurt anyone. But in a real combat scenario, that hidden threat at 500 meters would have been picking off soldiers while everyone celebrated hitting the easy target. I chose to engage the real threat. M. The laughter that followed my missed shots didn't bother me. I've been laughed at before, usually by people who mistake volume for confidence, who confuse obvious targets for real threats. What bothered me was something else entirely. Those young soldiers had never been taught to look beyond the obvious. They had been trained to follow orders, hit targets, and measure success by the simplest metrics. But no one had taught them to think like warriors. No one had shown them that the enemy doesn't always announce himself with bright colors at convenient distances. No one had explained that sometimes the hardest shot is the one that saves lives instead of taking them. During those 2 weeks of training, I watched those same soldiers transform. They learned to scan entire environments before engaging. They practiced threading impossible shots while protecting simulated civilians. They developed the tactical awareness that separates marksmen from warriors. Private Oliver Markham, the young man who had been loudest in his mockery, became one of the most thoughtful shooters I've ever trained. He learned that real skill isn't about showing off with easy targets. It's about making the hard choices, taking the difficult shots, and always knowing what you're aiming for and why. That's the lesson I want you to remember in your life. You'll face moments when everyone expects you to aim for the obvious target, the easy choice, the path that gets you quick applause and immediate approval. But true skill in shooting, in leadership, in life, comes from seeing the targets that matter most, even when they're harder to reach. Even when taking that shot means people will think you missed. Even when doing the right thing looks like failure to everyone watching. The best shots aren't always the ones that hit the biggest targets. Sometimes, they're the ones that hit the targets no one else even sees.